It's a bit mystifying, the thought that all you have to do is produce something of quality to achieve success. This was spoken by producer Toshio Suzuki, the often unsung third godfather of Studio Ghibli. He, along with its original magnates Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata, have collaborated since the early 1980s. Together, they have made a name for themselves for their unprecedented quality in both animation and cinema at large, borrowing settings and imagery from Japanese folklore and infusing it with something resembling European culture, often with the addition of some respectable nods to their favorite pieces of classic literature. Their unparalleled imaginations, combined with the conscious eye they've kept on capturing the smaller idiosyncrasies of life, have led to a collection of some of the richest films ever put to screen. It's funny then to reflect on the simplicity of Suzuki's statement, when with each major project, the trio appear to redefine the term quality as best they can. So with that, let's find out just how right he is. This is every Studio Ghibli film ranked. I hope you enjoy the video, and that somewhere along the line I did justice to your favorite. Number 23. For the better part of the last decade, there's been somewhat of an unofficial hiatus for Studio Ghibli. It began with Takahata's retirement and eventual passing in 2018, followed by the internal restructuring of the company. Many of its up-and-coming animators have shifted to the newly founded Studio Ponok, and very soon Miyazaki and Suzuki will have to retire themselves. There may still be films released under the Ghibli banner going forward, but the loss of all these prominent figures will mark this as a turning point in Japanese animation. With Miyazaki's final film, How Do You Live, on the horizon, this collection of 24 films over the span of their first 40 years will remain distinguished as their own saga. So it is with regret just how close they were to closing this saga out with an almost unblemished record, even as recently as 2020, because that was the year the studio released the TV movie Earwig and the Witch, and in stark contrast to the very best of Ghibli, it is absolutely fucking dreadful.
Don't be rude.
It's impossible to get into the deeper issues of Earwig and the Witch without first addressing the obvious. It looks terrible. Transitioning to 3D always carried the risk of losing their timelessness, but given their proclivity for quality 2D animation, there was no reason to doubt Ghibli could achieve something monumental here. Their first foray into 3D could have been a new paradigm shift, much like how Toy Story broke boundaries for Disney Pixar back in 1995. But Earwig and the Witch is not merely ugly, it's soulless. This is a serious blight and immediately secured itself as Ghibli's most dated film. The story, such as there is one, is nothing short of obnoxious. What we're subjected to is a series of barely sequential events where a young orphan named Earwig is adopted by a witch and a mandrake. Their interactions are comprised mostly of sneering and defiance on all sides, and the movie rather presumptuously expects us to root for Earwig, despite being the worst culprit of them all.
It doesn't make any sense.
All she seems to do is manipulate everyone around her and then get upset whenever her ruses don't work, but it's far more instinctive to go against what the movie hopes you will and just despise her as much as the rest.
We'll take this one.
Even the cover art is indicative of the lack of care and attention that went into this. At face value, it suggests a direction the story is heading that never happens. You would rightly think that Earwig eventually makes peace with her new parents and they form a band, and somewhere along the way she learns a lesson about channeling her innate talents for good. For all intents and purposes, that looked like the original plan for this movie, but somehow this is a plot point that's relegated to the end credits. Her birth mother, who it turns out was a former bandmate to the witch and the mandrake, turns up unannounced at the end, and that's it. None of this actually happens in the movie.
Now, why don't we finish things? There are many, many reasons.
To make matters worse, the story and atmosphere are borrowed liberally from other, far more successful anime, and it's especially egregious with Studio Ghibli's own Kiki's delivery service.
Earwigs, ooh!
This is another even bigger pitfall that Ghibli had never fallen into before now. By ripping off other popular anime, as well as cannibalizing one of its own, it emulates what's contemporary in order to pass itself off as legitimate. But since it can only cobble together the general ideas of those stories, it's disconnected from any real values, so themes of growth or responsibility or empowerment are alluded to but never followed through because all of the main characters are repugnant and none of them ever change. Because everything is so empty and lifeless, extra strain has to be put on the voice actors. But in keeping with the barrel scraping approach this film is committed to, this meant turning your typical English character into crass British caricatures.
For the first time in my life, I'm being made to do something I don't want to do.
My name is Bella Yaga. I'm a witch.
Hang on, you actually talk?
I can't believe you've done this.
So every character shares the same attributes and they're all grating and I fucking hate it. It really is as tedious as it sounds. For a kids movie, Earwig and the Witch is the unholy trifecta of animation. It's populated solely with unlikable characters, it has a story that relegates its main plot to a cliffhanger, and it sports some of the ugliest visuals in the medium. It is bad by any metric, and Ghibli should absolutely scrub it from their catalogue. I do have faith the studio can salvage some of the damage done here, and perhaps one day they will deliver that exceptional 3D animated feature, but the day should never have come where we have to hesitate to say that Ghibli is the studio with the perfect record.
Every single fucking thing about you is ugly.
Number 22. In the mid-2000s, Miyazaki's son Goro was convinced by longtime producer Toshio Suzuki to helm Ghibli's upcoming project. The idea presumably was for him to eventually succeed his father, and despite his initial hesitation due to their rocky relationship, he took the job. His debut was Tales from Earthsea, a truncated adaptation of the long-running book saga of the same name, and much like how we can't discuss Ghibli's best without Hayao Miyazaki, we can't discuss Ghibli's worst without Goro. What's billed as an epic fantasy adventure is held together exclusively by stock fantasy tropes, in place of any real direction or character. In other words, it's nothing you haven't seen before and it doesn't go anywhere. But that only accounts for why it's boring. Where it earns its reputation as one of Ghibli's worst is a lot more damning. The main character Aaron and the main villain Cobb are both unhealthily obsessed with death. It is the thought that plagues them throughout the story and often expressed in the form of gratuitous imagery or edgy diatribes about the futility of existence. Since this message is conveyed by not one but two main characters, it's up to our third and final main character, Sparrowhawk, to traffic in the contrasting moral that life is still meant to be lived even in the face of our own mortality. Sparrowhawk's lofty speeches about balance and equilibrium may have resonated more if you didn't have to keep reminding yourself of who he is and what he or any of these characters are wandering towards. It's also ironic that he talks about the necessity of balance with regards to life and death, but the film itself doesn't balance these at all, skewing in favor for the one that's absent of any purposeful discussion here. The worst offender is Aaron. His internal struggle with mortality might have held some weight where he seemed to gradually come to respect and value life. It could have set up a neat dichotomy where we root for him to overcome his demons in contrast to the villain who only sinks further and further into his obsession. In the right hands, there was a moral lesson to be unearthed there about refusing to let the fear of death cripple us in life. But what attempts are made to express that are way too sparse to counterbalance the constant, aimless misery. The allusions to death are callous and never developed, and the occasional respite is buried under allusions to other enterprises like drug addiction and child slave trading. Wasn't this supposed to be about dragons? After a promising first scene, the narrative opens with Aaron murdering his own father in cold blood. His father was the king and by all accounts a good man, and without justification for this seemingly random and selfish act, there's just nothing to endear us to him. And the first to recognize this problem was Hayao Miyazaki himself when he walked out of his own son's premiere.
Fuck you, Dad.
And what's really telling is that before he left, this is the scene that is happening.
僕は父を殺したんだ。父を刺してここまで来てしまった。わからないんだ。どうしてあんなことをしたのか。父は立派な人だよ。ダメなのは僕の方さ。いつも不安で自信がないんだ。
Aaron is not a character, much less a hero. He comes off more like a vessel for Goro Miyazaki to channel his angst. And whether he was conscious of it or not, the subject of that angst was his father, the benevolent king beloved by everyone. Perhaps all of this is what prompted Miyazaki to say during that cigarette, soon after the premiere, the shared sentiment of the public was that they had overestimated Goro Miyazaki. In partial defense of the man, he did have the weight of both the Ghibli name and the family name on his shoulders, and that's to say nothing of the extra scrutiny that goes on adaptations of an already beloved novel series. Maybe he was doomed to fail from the start. I do feel for the man, but that is where my sympathies end, because whatever frustrations he had with life or his father, no one forced him to air them out this blatantly and this publicly. And the nihilistic subject matter requires a degree of maturity and nuance that was clearly out of his domain. Tales from Earthsea doesn't move so much as wallow. It's far too dark for children and far too shallow for adults, and nihilism as a theme runs completely antithetical to Ghibli's otherwise universal appeal. It drags it down from merely not good to pretty irredeemable. It remains to this day the studio's most infamous cautionary tale about producer-sanctioned nepotism, and proves that sometimes the apple falls far from the tree.
What else are you on? I'm on fucking crack, yo.
Number 21. By the early 1990s, and having proved themselves as the new pioneers of anime, the studio enlisted their B team to produce and release their first independent feature, one that would be made without the guiding hands of Miyazaki or Takahata. It was a risky prospect and kept appropriately small scale with a muted runtime and no complex animation or fantasy elements to speak of. Nevertheless, it was an exercise that allowed any new up-and-comers to spread their wings, and had things gone as intended, could have helped secure the studio's future. Unfortunately, their first attempt ran both over time and over budget, and as a result, Ocean Waves is unfinished, existing now as Ghibli's first big misstep. Ordinarily, I prefer not to harp on the technical failings of a film too much. My concern is predominantly story and character, and so long as they remain intact, there's a lot I can overlook. But here, the technical failings are both so apparent and so fundamental, they're at once impossible not to notice, while also having an adverse effect on the deeper narrative. These are the types of editing mistakes you're just not supposed to see, like how the aspect ratio changes to the point where the whole screen might shrink in the middle of a scene, or how static shots will have very blatant clipping from one part to the next.
お金貸してくれない?
For how noticeable these are, it goes beyond basic errors and suggests instead that the film was abandoned and released without any kind of final screening. It starts with a man named Taku flying to his high school reunion, and on the way he reminisces about the relationships that defined his time there. In particular, the one with his best friend Yutaka and the girl named Rikako, who almost came between them. As the plane nears its destination, Taku comes to realize that he still loves the girl in question, and with each flashback effectively building anticipation for their reunion, all of it leads to the ultimate question of will she return Taku's affections? Frankly, it's a solid framework. It allows for an increasing array of complex emotions to build up as the destination continually encroaches. There is absolutely a good film to be made here, but it wasn't just the technical aspects that were butchered, it was the script itself. And I assume, due to time or budget restraints, whatever rewrites were made to the characters couldn't also be reflected in the animation. So what you're seeing in the final film is new text that doesn't match the original subtext. Take the final 3 scenes for example. First, Taku's plane lands and he meets with Yutaka. He then invites him for a walk along the pier, which can be reasonably assumed to have been a pivotal scene in the pre-production stage, considering it's the film's only depiction of ocean waves, and where the text has both gentlemen reaffirming that Taku loves Rikako and the pair belong together, it does so in the face of the super obvious gay subtext.
あの時俺が怒ったがはお前が俺に遠慮しよったのが分かったきぞ。あの時まで気がつかんかった。お前が武藤を好きやったこと。
The atmosphere of the scene is completely at odds with the words the characters are saying, and if the technical issues are anything to go by, the creators presumably knew this but lacked the resources to amend it and hoped it would go unnoticed, despite the aforementioned super obvious gay subtext. Second, they arrive at the reunion, which the whole narrative has been leading towards, and Rikako doesn't show up. This should have affirmed for Taku that what he'd built her up as was mostly in his head, and I even think this could have made for a great revelation in of itself, where the message of the film touches on how nostalgia can cloud our judgments, or the dangers at looking at someone through rose-tinted glasses. But in the text, he takes her absence as confirmation that she loves him back, and it's inexplicably counted as a victory. Finally, Taku sees Rikako at a train station, and judging from their coyness and the admittedly catchy theme song, this is supposedly the first day of the rest of their lives together. But in what is the most tone-deaf aspect of this whole thing, Taku reminisces about their time together, which is comprised of a montage of all of their interactions recycled from prior scenes, and in every single one, Rikako is nothing less than an absolute nightmare.
生理の初日が重いの。ここに泊まるわ。請求書はパパに行くんだから、私にも権利あるでしょ。ずいぶん友達思いじゃない？バカ！あんたなんか最低よ！
This is a character with zero redemptive qualities whatsoever. She lies, complains, and even steals, and when others rightfully call her out, she falls back on a victim mentality which goes unchecked and actively enabled throughout the story.
Oh, the old succubus.
She is a cry bully through and through, and the problem is that in universe, everyone including Taku, who receives the worst of her treatment, absolves her of her awful behavior.
これはドラマよりまだひどい。
I can't say whether Rikako was supposed to eventually be redeemed, and that those were some of the scenes that had to be dropped or reworked, but as far as the final product stands, she is an absolute monster, and the film approves of her.
She's a goddamn succubus!
And let's say I'm mistaken, if that really was the original conceit all along, then Ocean Waves is nothing more than a self-serving exercise in solipsism, one that fulfills an absurd fantasy that you can behave vile beyond comprehension and still receive adoration. These final few scenes were a display so completely disconnected from the reality of this situation. The only reasonable explanation is that it had to have been stitched together from the only footage they had. They likely wanted this to make sense, and you can make out an idea of a story they wanted to tell, but whatever issues arose behind the scenes ultimately sabotaged this whole thing. It's a technical mess that butchered its characters to become a vapid melodrama about an entitled brat and the guy who worships her, essentially a love triangle with neither the love nor the triangle.
Succubus trying to take my baby!
It's the only Ghibli film that has never received an English dub, so it's safe to say that of all the Ghibli catalogue, this is the one they've seen fit to abandon, and so perhaps it's better to just let this one stay in obscurity. Number 20. From Up on Poppy Hill is Goro Miyazaki's best movie.
I'm getting really sick of you!
And while it's admirable he didn't completely shit the bed, From Up on Poppy Hill is only competent, and in a series as stacked as Ghibli, competent will only ever appear as a cut below the standard. It lacks so many of their usual identifying markers that you'd be forgiven for thinking it was from a different studio entirely, and it's probably the only example of a Ghibli film that takes no real advantage of the medium, and so the only remarkable aspect of this one is just how unremarkable it is.
I have no strong feelings one way or the other.
It's a tale of teenage activism that takes place just prior to the Japanese Olympics. In preparation, the school board looks to build some real estate when a group of high school students led by the very spirited Shun stands up to the powers that be in order to keep their beloved clubhouse from being torn down. Meanwhile, the other protagonist, Umi, is your typical hard-working Japanese student. With her mother abroad and her father having been killed in the Korean War, she fulfills their roles and keeps the house running for her younger brothers and sisters. And every morning, without fail, she raises the flags in her front yard for the passing sailors, in honor of her father. Both of these characters adequately exemplify the core value of this story, which is that of keeping the connection to your past alive. If we bulldoze our way to a future without careful consideration, we risk losing more of our heritage than we might mean to. And it's a fitting analogy for a story set in Japan, given how these social values are just as prevalent there today as they were back in the 1960s. This is the film's strength, while Shun, Umi, and the supporting characters are all at an intersection between likable enough to support but plain enough to completely forget. The biggest draw is the clubhouse itself. It's evocative of your usual childhood activities like building a fort or playing in a treehouse, and because of that, it's easy to sympathize in the wake of its being demolished. More than just a building, it's a place of refuge where these teenagers are free to discover and nurture their interests, and it successfully exudes that vibrance of young minds that are free to run amok. Much like its occupants, there's limitless potential within and an equal degree of shoddiness too. Its eventual renovation at the end demonstrates a happy middle ground between the two conflicting ideologies, telling us there is always a way to adapt and change with the times without necessarily uprooting everything that came before. The reason it's important is because the clubhouse is what ultimately ties these characters and these themes together, and without sympathy for its demolition, From Up on Poppy Hill might have had absolutely nothing else going for it. And this brings me to the one subplot that had no business being included, making the third of 3 strikes for Goro Miyazaki.
Stop it.
As the two protagonists get closer, Shun notices that the story of Umi's father bears a striking resemblance to that of his own, and the revelation that they may be brother and sister momentarily interrupts what looks to be a budding romance. Not only does this unnaturally stall the plot, but by the end it's resolved with no conflict whatsoever, and I can only surmise it was included to compensate for the general lack of personality or interest elsewhere. And the irritating thing is how obvious the solution was. Had the story simply picked one of these dynamics and stuck with it, either one could have worked and been justified. In scenario A, Shun and Umi are revealed as brother and sister, with no romance explored. Since Umi's trauma is the loss of her family, as evidenced by her dreams, this discovery would mean everything to her. She'd get to recapture a piece of what she's craved more than anything, and Shun will have found a place to call home. And now together they can keep flying the flags. Even if they lose the clubhouse, it wouldn't matter, because that was the event that helped this family become whole again. Or in scenario B, this brother-sister twist is dropped entirely. With their struggles behind them, they'd now be set to start their relationship, and eventually their own family, passing down to her younger siblings the responsibility of flying the flags. In either case, what came before is honored and protected, while our main characters build a new future together. This is by all means the core concept, but instead they threw both ideas in at once, and all it did was serve as dramatic fodder that amounted to nothing. Ultimately, the main message of From Up on Poppy Hill is solid. I just wish the final product had that kind of spark we associate with the Ghibli label. It may well be the best that Goro Miyazaki has in him, but I sincerely hope he finds something else soon.
This is not okay. This needs to stop now.
Number 19. With their temporary hiatus in 2014, Studio Ghibli's de facto swan song for 6 years had been When Marnie Was There. It marked what felt like a premature and unceremonious end to a beloved era in anime. As their final theatrical release at time of recording, it fittingly boasts some of the studio's best and smoothest artwork, but unfortunately it's all in service of a rather insipid and frequently melodramatic story that crosses the line between sweet and sickly sweet. For failing to really break the surface of its themes, this was a relative low point for the studio to end on. Ghibli made their name because they were impossible to emulate, and When Marnie Was There could not only be emulated, but it could be done better. It begins with Anna, who, between the loss of her family and her recent diagnosis of asthma, falls into a depression and must move out to the countryside where the air is cleaner. Due to her age and her trauma, and for having to uproot her life like this, she finds herself understandably disengaged from others, finding comfort instead in self-isolation and sketching. And though she struggles to come to terms with herself or make any strong friendships, everything changes on the day she spots an old house from across the marsh. It's there where she meets Marnie, a ghostly apparition that Anna can't help but feel some connection to, and so the mystery of her identity begins to unfold. Who is Marnie? And the problem lies with the answer to that twist, which is that Marnie is really Anna's grandmother, and both were left broken over the loss of Marnie's daughter and Anna's mother. This story is about coming to terms with and forgiving yourself for circumstances you couldn't control. These are believably realized through Anna and Marnie's relationship. What the twist misses is that Anna and Marnie didn't need to be tied together by the same trauma for their transformation to take effect, and it was tacked on as a flat-out expression after the initial reveal because, as I suspect, the filmmakers knew there were just way too many mental gymnastics it required. All that was necessary between them was for that brief moment in time they had each other, and the realization that they are good enough no matter how others made them feel was enough to allow Marnie to rest in peace and for Anna to develop the conviction needed to face the world and live her life. Now they never have to feel alone again. I'm just not sure how the further revelation that the two characters were related and share the same trauma adds to this. It feels like another case of a twist for a twist's sake, and upon learning this, Anna never gets to confront Marnie with it. Although perhaps that was a deliberate choice, since coming to terms with a lack of catharsis is reflective of the film's message, and I would still call it a promising indication of where the animators are heading in their future. But I think in the end this one overall was too saccharine to stomach. What I will say in the film's favour is that this song and the sentiment behind it lingered with me far longer than the narrative itself did. Fine on the outside refers to the brave face Anna puts on, having had to suppress her emotions all the time.
この世には目に見えない魔法の輪がある。輪には内側と外側があって、私は外側の人間。
By the end, the same song plays again, only this time it's been recontextualized.
To be okay with just me, and I'll be fine on the outside.
The outside is no longer in reference to Anna's exterior, but the invisible circle. She's still outside of that circle, but she realizes it's futile trying to be anywhere else. Maybe she belongs on the outside, and for coming to terms with that, the invisible circle is no longer a source of anxiety for her. And so long as she carries with her her memories of Marnie, she'll always be fine on the outside.
あなたが好きよ。何？
It's details like this that keep me from wanting to criticize this one too harshly. Ghibli films have very few weaknesses between them, but if there's one criticism that can be brushed across their whole library, it's that their endings tend to wrap up too quickly. This is likely the result of the relatively fluid approach taken in animation, where only the broad strokes of the story are conceived of ahead of time, and the tale is free to grow in the drawing. Provided a film like this is engrossing enough, it's easy to suspend any disappointments in the ending, but when Marnie Was There asks too much of you in this regard. They had to have known this twist wasn't baked in very well, and so faced with the option of either integrating it more seamlessly or dropping it altogether, they compromised, releasing all the remaining disconnected pieces at the end. For some, it won't be a problem at all. The strength of the platonic bond between Anna and Marnie will supersede the clunkiness of their forced familial bond, but for others, it'll probably raise more questions than answers. I must stress, unlike some of the other lesser entries here, there will be a large audience for this one. I'm just not sure I was it. This is one of those coming-of-age films that is sure to resonate within its demographic of young teenagers, but fails to traverse outside of that circle. Its artwork is stunning, but its story is insipid, and your enjoyment will depend on which of those is the bigger priority for you. I wish Ghibli could have ended their proverbial reign on a higher note, and I hope upon rewatch I come to appreciate the film more, but until then, I'll be fine on the outside. Number 18.
And what happened was, as soon as Andrew said, "You owe her an apology," he went, it's like the switch flipped back.
He said, "I'm glad I'm the fucking sheriff of this shit-ass fucking town."
There was once a time where Hayao Miyazaki met with Hollywood mogul and despicable piece of shit Harvey Weinstein. They were set to discuss the stipulations regarding the localization of Ghibli films in the West, and Weinstein, being the self-serving cunt that he was, threatened to butcher Miyazaki's films as he saw fit.
And no cars, no nothing. Otherwise, never any of my shit ever. Okay? I will fucking be all over your ass. Let's get out of here.
Have a good night, man.
Never work in this town. You'll never sell a fucking photograph crap anywhere.
Miyazaki, who for his films often personally hand-drew upwards of 100,000 animation cells in painstaking detail, stood up and stormed out of their meeting in disgust. Shortly after, in an effort to maintain relations while still firmly standing their ground, producer Toshio Suzuki sent Weinstein a replica katana, and inscribed on the blade of that katana was the simple message: no cuts. And from that day on, Miyazaki set the precedent that not one frame from any Ghibli film would be altered for the Western market, not by Weinstein nor anybody else, and to this day he maintains that victory, declaring, "I defeated him." Now, I would give anything to have witnessed that meeting firsthand. You have the voice of Japanese cinema for a generation stood across Hollywood's most intimidating figure and literal rapist, and he basically told him to go fuck himself. That is the stuff of legends, and I'm glad to do my part in sharing that story, but the real reason I'm telling you about it is because I absolutely refuse to believe that the character designs of Pom Poko weren't a direct influence from the sheer size of Hayao Miyazaki's balls. Pom Poko is an environmentally conscious film about a gang of tanuki whose territories are being invaded by human construction workers. Though locked together in this Cold War, the humans are for the most part oblivious to the tanuki, providing them ample time to hone their transformation skills in preparation for a series of pranks.
Now then, notice this fine red blanket we are all sitting on. Want to know what it is?
It's my balls!
This gives way to the various antics that make up this film, but as playful as it is, it's also in service of that message that mankind has traded in its connection with nature for a more convenient and catered to lifestyle. And as victims of that trade, the tanuki have had no choice but to fight back. But now the remnants of the humans' hedonistic lifestyle, such as television and fast food, are managing to demotivate some of them too. Presenting us a vicious cycle where the humans and tanuki keep dragging each other down. It's a plea for us to be more conscientious of the environmental damage we cause. And for the most part it works, but the core issue with Pom Poko is that it's everything I just described, and what I described does not require 2 hours of repetition, the worst of which comes in at the very end.
Hello? Many of you have probably heard someone on the news saying how animals are disappearing because of development. It's true that some raccoons can transform and disappear, although, what about things like rabbits and badgers? They can't transform, so where do they go?
It's quite the death knell to have your weakest scene at the end of your film, after 2 hours of stopping and starting to repeat this exact message. This fourth wall break was neither necessary nor welcome. I'm sure there's some irony to be had there about the film's penchant for recycling, but it's repetitive all the same. Part of the reason it was made this way was to appeal to kids and warn them of the dangers of unchecked industrialization. But even taking that into consideration, the film relies way too heavily on its narrator to explain contents that are not all that complicated to begin with. For all its faults, Pom Poko is at least a unique experience. The absolute absurdity of the ways the tanuki use their giant magic ball sacks to attack humans is not something you'll likely find anywhere else. These transformations are, for the lack of a better term, the best part, and the tanuki seamlessly transition from anthropomorphized to realistic to cartoonish. It makes switching between moments of levity and tragedy a lot more palatable. You'd think, given how Pom Poko was a rare collaboration by Miyazaki and Takahata, that it would have been a happier marriage of their two styles. It has the environmental concerns of the former and the slice of life ambience of the latter. There's flashes of each of their strengths, but it doesn't disguise the fact that once you've seen it, or even a part of it, you pretty much get it, and there's not much incentive to watch it again. I mean, unless you like balls.
I love your balls!
Number 17.
А всего лишь петуньи и...
Often in filmmaking, you hear the term production hell get thrown around. In fact, it's such a common occurrence, it's practically an industry standard by this point, and there isn't even an opposite term for it since it's so rare. But apparently that was exactly the case with The Cat Returns. What began as a 20-minute concept started to garner enthusiasm during production, and from there it organically bloomed into a theatrical feature. And it only adds to the wholesomeness of this one since it clearly brought out all the best in the talent involved. The Cat Returns is very unassuming, which makes sense this is a holdover from its humble beginnings as a short movie. It has a softer and more rounded animation style and only a 75-minute runtime, so if there was ever a Ghibli film to point squarely at younger children, this would be it. The story is of a young girl named Haru who one day rescues a cat, but what she doesn't know is that this cat is cat royalty and she's unwittingly opened the door to an entire secret cat kingdom, who now consider her their guest of honor. On her journey, she meets some other outcasts, one of whom introduces himself as the Baron, and this is a name that will be familiar to longtime fans of Ghibli as he made his debut in Whisper of the Heart, making The Cat Returns the first and only true spin-off from another Ghibli production. Here, the Baron's role is much more pronounced. He's more charming and action-oriented, and when Haru is kidnapped and starts turning into a cat herself, he is the one to swing in at the end and rescue her. The climax is replete with the common tropes of heroes in disguise, sword fights in castles, and a race against the clock. It's all very standard fare, which in another movie may have been a detriment, but given its target audience, I think employing these very basic tropes only with a bunch of cats works in its favor. It's easy to follow and easy to enjoy, and I'd say it clears the bar that it aimed for, even if that bar wasn't very high to begin with.
Okay, maybe there wouldn't be cats surrounding your building if you didn't have open cans of cat food everywhere.
I have 50 cats howling outside my window because I have 10,000 rats running around my building, Dee, okay?
Stop yelling,
I'm not an idiot!
And this is the only real drawback with The Cat Returns, that it wasn't more ambitious. Typically, where the first act sets up the conflict and the third act resolves the conflict, the second act is reserved for world exploration and character building. And this film, for some reason, skims over that part. You have the ordinary girl whisked away to another kingdom with promises of riches and status. There she meets a roguish figure who warns her about the new environment, but she continues onwards anyway. Now in the belly of the beast, the evil king reveals his plan to keep her there forever, prompting her and the rogue to reunite and make their escape. Now back home, the status quo is reset, but the girl has changed and for the better. It's as classic a template as you can get, but the missed potential lies somewhere in the middle of that framework. Sometimes the second act alone can account for half an entire film. It's where the main character wanders in amazement at their new surroundings, slowly getting acclimatized to them. It's also generally supposed to be the most fun, if not feature a lot of action or drama. But The Cat Returns doesn't take advantage of this, and when one of your voice actors is Tim Curry, that is unforgivable.
Just a sweet transvestite.
At a modest 75-minute runtime, it'd be easy to locate opportunities to fill in that time with Haru exploring the Cat Kingdom, even giving serious consideration as to whether she wants to stay or return home. Needless to say, young children would neither notice nor care about this, but to leave such a huge chunk of potential interest on the table is a wasted opportunity all the same. It could have graduated from a good film for children to a good film period. The Cat Returns is exactly as it appears, not necessarily deep or substantive, but it's not grating or patronizing either. Less a feature-length adventure and more like an illustrated bedtime story turned anime. It hits that sweet spot where it's an all-round harmless experience, and one that fans of Whisper of the Heart especially are sure to appreciate, given the headcanon that this is the story that Shizuku ends up writing by the end of that film, though your mileage may vary on that one.
Thanks a lot, babe.
Number 16. On first impression, My Neighbors the Yamadas looks the most out of place in the Ghibli library. It's a series of vignettes with no real overarching story. It was their first all-digital production, essentially a glorified tech demo, and save for the occasional dreamlike sequence, it's lacking any real fantastical elements. It was also released between two of its heaviest hitters, Princess Mononoke and Spirited Away, so it's no wonder it often finds itself buried among the rest. I'll admit to having some hesitation going into this one, despite knowing nothing about it except for its strange animation style. I wasn't wholly convinced this would have a Ghibli feel to it, but I was surprised at how much I enjoyed it. It's less a film and more like a sitcom of a family traversing through domestic life in contemporary Japan, bumping heads together along the way. The events range from dealing with in-laws to fighting over the remote control. It's all very trivial, but good fun in the same vein as something like what The Simpsons used to be.
あ、父さんケーキの残り。
コーラお願い。
みかんも。それから灯油入れといてください。すみません。
And with all the chapters broken up clearly, it's a lot punchier and more digestible. Perhaps Takahata's prior film Pom Poko would have fared better had it been divided into a similar framework. As for the animation, the translation from page to scene is literally identical and sure to be appreciated by any fans of the original manga. But even without the direct comparison, I'd say the animation is conservative in all the right ways and more nuanced than it might appear at first glance. The backgrounds, for instance, may be barren, but it rarely feels like details are missing, only drawing your attention more closely to the focal point. And it probably requires some considerable forethought for the team to know exactly what detail to include and how much of it like that. So I commend my Neighbors the Yamadas for being a fruitful exercise for Takahata. He would later use the lessons learned here for his more ambitious projects down the line, and for how basic the premise of this one was, he could have easily treated it like a secondary project, but I don't think he did. It very much feels like the progression of his style, and I'd say despite the lukewarm reception this one receives, the Yamadas was a big enough stepping stone in his career at Ghibli to warrant a look. Really, the selling point is the comedy, and though it might not be to everyone's taste, the good thing is you'd only need to watch as far as the end of the first 1 or 2 vignettes to know if it's for you or not. And that's it.
You know, that's the end. Doesn't have to be a whole big thing every single time. You know, that's life. That's just sort of how shit goes.
Number 50. When I think of The Wind Rises, I'm reminded of films like Akira Kurosawa's Dreams or Martin Scorsese's Hugo. In all 3 cases, the directors had already left behind an accomplished and widely recognized filmography, and now in the winter of their lives, they'd chosen to make something else entirely. Kurosawa withdrew from his Shakespearean and historical epics to paint his dreams, sharing with us the last scattershots of his unrealized visions before passing away. Scorsese broke away from religion and gangster culture to show a child growing in tandem with the first developments of cinema. And Miyazaki came out of retirement one more time, not to grace us with a look into another world, but to present us the untold biopic of a man of preeminent brilliance and originality, one whose talents were sadly misappropriated and ultimately contributed to one of the darkest chapters in modern history. There's a lot to be said for this type of film, one that doesn't necessarily cater to a wider audience or live up to a director's established persona, but instead targets only the individual who it might just resonate with the most. World War II as a setting may be absent in Miyazaki's works, but it's one the man himself had been very familiar with growing up. The subject of this chapter is Jiro, who lives out his dream as an aeronautical engineer in Tokyo. He's a man so skilled at his craft that his designs are the ones selected for use in the latest Japanese fighter planes. But his pride turns to grief upon the knowledge that the designs selected for use were for the kamikaze assault on Pearl Harbor. Miyazaki films have never contained an internal conflict quite like this before. By clashing the machinations of war with the noble pursuit of following your dreams, he shows the ugly side of doing what we love. Much of his struggle is presented through Jiro's dreams, where as a boy he has frequent conversations with a man named Caproni. This is the man who invented the Caproni CA-309 Ghibli, the model of airplane that provided the studio with their namesake and the very one they find themselves standing on. Perhaps like Kurosawa, this dreamscape had been a place of solace for Miyazaki during his career, and now he's decided to share a glimpse of it with us. But mostly, I'm curious about what this suggests about Miyazaki's own connection to Jiro. Does he feel a reverence for this man for inspiring his personal fascination with airplanes and is now speaking to him as fan to hero? Or is this conversation from one artist to another, with Miyazaki shining a sympathetic light on a controversial figure, one who inspired him and who Miyazaki has since surpassed in terms of adoration? Or perhaps he feels a kind of kinship with an artist whose creations ended up doing more harm than good. It feels like that surely couldn't be the case, since Miyazaki's own works have only served to enrich culture, not degrade or deform it. So is this shame? Because in some sense, this film feels like penance for his being beloved by the whole world, while a man like Jiro, who he easily could have been himself under different circumstances, has either been condemned or forgotten. Contrasting these dreams are Jiro's nightmares, where he sees his planes crashing down all around him, with their voices groaning from the sputtering of engines. It's as if the planes are some twisted living organisms, and each one lost is another case of squandered potential. On the one hand, Miyazaki is telling Jiro's perspective with a sympathetic eye, but upon a reassessment, you might second guess that. He's still a tragic figure, but maybe he lacked the motivation to really find and remove his blind spots. Maybe on some level he didn't want to. And it becomes most challenging to stick with your initial sympathies when you line this film up with something like Grave with the Fireflies, and you realize Jiro's actions are what directly contributed to these events, and many more like them. Ultimately, his poor judgment took its toll, and the entire world suffered for it, when all the man wanted to do was make something great. It's funny because this is Miyazaki's least fantastical film, yet it's the one that gives me the most trouble to discern all of its deeper meanings. More than just about Jiro, it's designed to provide insight into Miyazaki's sensibilities, not just as an artist, but as a human being. So it's the least Miyazaki-like film, but probably his most personal. His more famous works are representative of the legend that he is, whereas this feels more like it questions the value of that legend, and in parallel with the man like Jiro, reminds us of the folly of man. Or maybe this film was his way of vicariously living out his own unrealized childhood dream of designing airplanes, a dream that, unlike Scorsese's stand-in in Hugo, he couldn't pursue in his own life and now no longer has time for. For how much speculation there's to be had here, I suspect The Wind Rises will only grow in appreciation over time. I believe Miyazaki was the only one who could have told this exact story, and when I look at it, I see all the hallmarks of a film that will not be for everyone, but to someone it will matter the most.
Arigato.
And there's a lot to be said about movies like that. Number 14. Laputa, the eponymous castle in the sky, exists in a moment in time where mankind's ambitions have been oversatiated. In their pursuit of a world of flying castles, society has tried to imprint on the course of nature by way of technology, but in doing so interrupts the innate harmony of things. This has had an adverse effect on people's relationships to one another, as most of the population, as goofy as they may be, act on self-interest, and with no one keeping an eye on where we're all collectively heading, we're now long past the point where places like Laputa have descended into myth. But a young miner boy inspired by tales from his father never stops believing in the legend, and as fate would have it, a resident of Laputa gently floats down from the sky, safely cushioned by her crystal pendant, which points the way back home. Pazu and Shita strike up a chemistry together I think most would recognize if they record back to their first ever crush, and on their first big adventure they meet all manner of shady characters. It's in the clashing of their various personalities that the heart of this adventure comes alive. From the aggressive military to the rogue sky pirates, each have their own reasons for wanting to find Laputa too, be it the glory of conquer, the ravishing of treasures, or simply returning home to duty. The tropes may all be familiar, but they're timeless for a reason, and for a then up-and-coming studio, it was prudent to follow a template we all know works than to try to reinvent the wheel too soon. Castle in the Sky is what I refer to as a conduit film, which at once borrows from a large helping of literary and contemporary cinematic influences, but in synthesizing them so well, it avoids feeling derivative and actually becomes influential in its own right. It reminds me of a quote by Stan Lee that every comic book is somebody's first, and the same applies here. The fact that we can still see its imprint in Western media today tells me that for a lot of Western animators, Castle in the Sky was either their first or their favorite. And for expanding its global reach after just one film under the official banner, Studio Ghibli was set to take on the world uninhibited from this point. The best part of Laputa are its residents, the Goliaths, who much like Laputa itself serve as a strange coalescence of nature and technology. On the surface, they're sluggish tools that only roam around following their basic programming, but underneath there's a hint of consciousness that gives each action some extra heft and subtlety. It's hard not to be transfixed by them when they fluctuate so dispassionately between threatening and harmonious, at 1 minute taking on an entire invasion, and in the next protecting these fragile eggs in a tiny bird's nest. When Laputa falls and exposes the surviving roots underneath, the allegory of mankind's destructive prowess and the reclamation that nature will inevitably stake is on point. Though all of this may sound agreeable, I actually consider Castle in the Sky overall to be among Miyazaki's lower tier works. This is in part simply due to the higher caliber of work he accomplished as a natural byproduct of his gaining more experience and refining his craft, but also because I absolutely despise the voice acting of the main two characters.
Shut the fuck up!
Which shouldn't be a deal breaker in of itself because we have the American dub, except...
Look, my stone's glowing. It's been in my family as long as I can remember.
Looks like a body.
What?
It makes the memory of watching Castle in the Sky much better than the actual experience of it. The villain, Colonel Mushka, is also far too comically mustache twirling and one of Miyazaki's weakest characters across all his films. For someone who usually shies away from black and white depictions of good and evil, as demonstrated in this very film with the Sky Pirates who go from villains to anti-heroes, Mushka is absurdly evil.
Bye, bitch!
He's so evil, he even shoots Pazu in the fucking face, and I feel like no one really takes this on board. I wonder then how much of Pazu's heroism is down to him not really processing the level of danger he's in. So Mushka's own lack of dimension is now actively harming the characters around him. Though I found the components of the film to be better than the actual experience of watching it, I still commend the momentum it gave the studio. It was the first real propulsion that Ghibli encountered, and it gave way for it to eventually become the cultural juggernaut we know it as today. So I can't hate it, I just can't stand listening to it, aside from the banging soundtrack. Number 13. After one of his many brief stints in retirement, Miyazaki was suddenly hit with one of his more salient ideas, and it wouldn't let go of him until he marched back to Ghibli HQ to take back his throne and purge it from his system. But unlike his other projects, the manner by which he was pitching and shaping these ideas wasn't always clear to his team, and it fell to producer Toshio Suzuki to rein him in and try to make more sense of it. What was clear was that this was very much his baby and made specifically to appeal to his youngest audience yet, as evidenced by its softer animation, brighter color palette, and nursery rhyme-like theme song.
Ponyo, 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 fishy in the sea. Tiny little fishy, who could you really be?
In 2008, Ponyo would finally see release, but to middling reception. Perhaps it was the incessant advertising campaign, or the decision to make it so overtly kid-friendly that put people off, or perhaps people recoiled at some of the more outlandish character designs.
What the hell is even that?
For one reason or another, Ponyo didn't attain quite as high a status as Miyazaki had hoped. That said, Ponyo was never the bad film some might have you believe. In fact, it's very sweet, but I can see why upon release people wondered what the hell it was supposed to be. The story is well tread ground by Ghibli standards, focusing on a core relationship between a regular boy and a magical girl he stumbles upon. They are Sosuke and Ponyo, and true to their 5-year-old nature, they are inquisitive about just about everything and intent on sharing every waking second together. It's about as adorable as they come. How Miyazaki can conceive of a film comprised largely of recycled or borrowed ideas and still give it its own identity is incredible. He pulls it off because he's committed to capturing the small habits of our daily lives that most of us either take for granted or don't notice at all. He's rarely wasted an opportunity to display character, even if it means spending an inordinate amount of personal time and resources to complete the work necessary for it. It's probably the same compulsion that causes his retirements to be so famously short-lived. If we take, say, the ham on ramen that Ponyo and Sosuke love so much, and he was made to justify the inclusion to a superior or a committee, they'd have axed it, citing its irrelevance to the plot, but in Ponyo, it fits right in, and it's probably what it's most famous for. Miyazaki can so easily break the convention of kill your darlings because for him, these aren't detracting from the experience, they are the experience. So Ponyo, if nothing else, is another window into the mind of a creative genius who's probably forgotten more about his craft than any of us are ever likely to learn. This is also a film where in the climax, Ponyo's transfer from sea to land causes a cosmic imbalance that brings about a tsunami. And even with that, it remains one of the lightest and more easily digestible works of the whole Ghibli canon somehow. I really applaud the restraint here, not to lean on natural disasters too flagrantly as a plot device. Instead, they're more measured and matter of fact, and somewhere in there is Miyazaki's reassurance that when natural disasters occur, it's important to stay calm and collected in the aftermath. You see it clearly enough in Ponyo's willingness to help a nearby family and their hungry baby who are stuck in a rowboat after the flooding begins. It's a lesson that might imbue children with a sense of that communal responsibility they would need under similar circumstances. Remember, it was only a few years after its release that the Tohoku earthquake occurred. I'm not suggesting Ponyo saved lives or anything so drastic, but were a child to have internalized Ponyo's positivity here, as she so contagiously depicts, it may have at least brought a comfort to a lot of the young Japanese populace at the time. Actually, I suspect this film does mean a lot to one person in particular, and that is Miyazaki's own son, Goro.
Oh, fuck.
Looking at the time frame of its production, this was selected as Ghibli's next big project, only after the failure of Tales from Earthsea, and I since came to learn that Sosuke was modeled after Goro Miyazaki. I think then that during his retirement, Miyazaki took stock of his role as a father. It's no secret he was an absentee, busy providing the world with some of its greatest animated features, much to the delight of other children. And after the fairly calamitous public reaction to Tales from Earthsea, he decided to make something else just for his son, and he was determined to pull himself from retirement and go ahead, even when others couldn't quite grasp why. I enjoy subscribing to the idea that artists do what they do sometimes with the hopes of reaching one person. It can be a way of granting yourself closure you couldn't otherwise have, like orchestrating a conversation with someone that you can't speak to anymore, like a lie we create in order to express the truth. And truthfully, Ponyo feels like his way to make amends, and now that the initial shock and confusion has worn off, I'm glad to see the scales tipping back in its favor more recently, because I don't think you can go wrong with Ponyo. Number 12. Given the breakthrough of Spirited Away back when it was released in Japan in 2001, and again when it broke the international market in 2003, Ghibli experienced its biggest and most important upsurge in popularity in the studio's history. Now, for the first time ever, there was active anticipation the world over for Hayao Miyazaki's next film, which would be released theatrically worldwide in 2004. With so many eyes on the then upcoming Howl's Moving Castle, and for being many people's reintroduction to Ghibli, it's unsurprising it's considered one of the greats. It's also nebulous as fuck and batshit insane. While this is Miyazaki's work at its most extravagant, it is also his messiest, and for reasons we'll get into, it's the only one of his proverbial classics that, while good, I'd consider undeserving of such acclaim.
Yeah, well, you know, that's just like, your opinion, man.
Calling out Howl's Moving Castle for its absurdities is not necessarily a hill I want to die on, but I'll start with the film's strength, which is in its lead romance. Sophie and Howl meet at a time where both have flawed self-images, preventing them from being all they could be. Sophie's is clear from the start, when after Howl literally sweeps her off her feet, the jealous and spiteful witch of the waste curses her to look on the outside how she feels on the inside. She is an old soul, a result of the lack of confidence she has in herself. Howl is similarly altruistic,
like this in the background, what the
but his problems are a lot more deep-seated. By day, he's smooth and chivalrous, and by night, he takes to the skies fighting in a covert war. He has all the hallmarks of a perfect hero, that is until Sophie accidentally turns him ginger and he throws a bitch fit.
What don't you fucking understand?
Howl's past trauma has locked him in this state of arrested development, and so buried underneath his hero complex is the fragility of your typical narcissist. It's an unexpected first act twist that recontextualizes the character and communicates just how seriously wounded Howl is. He'd like to commit to the charming persona he's already demonstrated, but he sorely lacks the maturity to maintain it. Sophie is too old and Howl is too young. She's always looking to help others and he is in desperate need of help, turning Howl's Moving Castle from an epic fantasy into the story of two broken people learning how to bring out the best in one another. My favorite indication of Sophie's love for Howl is when she reverts to youth while she's asleep, indicating that in her dreams she sees them together. And as for him, there's no clearer metaphor than the castle itself. The castle is Howl. It's his mind, his heart, and his memories, never fixed in any one position, but always familiar. It has many functions, but none of them are optimized or well supported. Like Howl, it's awe-inspiring on the outside and messy on the inside. It works in spite of itself. That is, until Sophie comes in and cleans it all up. Once Sophie removes Howl's heart from the castle, all the extraneous features strip away, just as Howl sheds the flashier parts of himself that no longer serve him. They're two people who came together and saved each other, and as far as romance goes, you couldn't ask for much more. So with all this praise for the core character development, why does Howl's Moving Castle fall short of its classic status? Probably because what I mentioned accounts for a single component of the film, and it's the rest of it that barely makes a lick of fucking sense. Sophie is our perspective character. Between her dropping into a larger world and Howl disappearing at night to fight his battles, the story sells us on the idea of much grander stakes occurring outside of her purview, from warring factions of wizards and witches to naval attacks and civilian casualties, and we're only ever given pieces that mostly serve as background fodder to the love story of Sophie and Howl. We can catch and appreciate the softer details without needing to fully comprehend them, but in Howl's Moving Castle, when tying up the loose ends of the story, this background element suddenly wedges itself to the forefront. It sees Sophie giving a mute scarecrow his one love's true kiss. This kiss breaks his spell, reverting him back to human. But Sophie isn't his true love, nor is he her true love. And now that he's free, he introduces himself as a missing prince, who by virtue of his return can now put an end to the war. And the end of the war occurs instantaneously and is free of repercussion. But then the whole war is revealed as having been orchestrated as part of a grander scheme to teach Howl a lesson about love. And also all of it was an allegory for the Iraq War.
What was that shit about
Iraq?
Dude, I'm sorry.
What the fuck does anything have to do with
Iraq?
What the fuck are you talking about?
In order to accept this ending, you're expected to take a lot at face value. And when you layer the story like this, it comes with the implicit guarantee that if you dissect it for long enough, you might discern its deeper meaning. But I'm just not so sure there is one here. I don't know how any of these components are meant to connect together, much less how we're supposed to accept it as both a sweet fairy tale ending and as a serious commentary on real-life global politics that was still ongoing at the time. Ordinarily, these kinds of hidden details are placed to beckon the audience to connect the story behind the story without being too intrusive for those who just want to enjoy the ride. And that is what great stories are made of. But when there is almost nothing in the film itself for reference, and even extraneous sources don't make the allegory any clearer, the narrative is asking too much of you. The film is still plenty fun and captivating, but it's by no means transcendent in the way that other original Miyazaki works are. Selecting the best Ghibli film of all time is a tough undertaking, but of all the titles that regularly have that label attributed to it, Howl's Moving Castle is the only one I'd remove from consideration. It's one of those films you have to be all in on, and that's clearly the case for many fans. But I'd say if this was someone's first introduction to Ghibli, or anime in general, it could just as readily put them off as entice them in. Number 11. There's no question that Ghibli has accrued worldwide notoriety as one of the leading powerhouses in animation, not least because of their ambition and visual fidelity, which makes it all the more heartbreaking to know that this was also the reason they had to eventually close their doors. At the cost of maintaining such an impeccable pedigree, it took Isao Takahata an unprecedented 8 years to complete work on his swan song, The Tale of the Princess Kaguya. Also securing the world record for the single most expensive Japanese film to date, as if to add one more accomplishment to his epitaph. And when you see it, especially its evolution of the watercolor style Takahata had previously experimented with, you see where that time and money went, because very few films look as good as this. Oh. Since the story is based on one of Japan's oldest surviving works of the Heian period, the template was already familiar, allowing for extra care and attention to be paid to the artwork itself. Here, the serene painting in motion-like atmosphere we've been accustomed to suddenly switches to these crude, charcoal-like scribbles, and it excellently conveys Kaguya's volatile mental state. At this point in the story, her autonomy has been stripped from her, and to express her shifting mood so harshly like this is an exceptional display of Takahata's talents as both storyteller and artist. Really, everything Takahata had learned about animation over the course of his 45-year career was building to this point, and it shows. It's a retelling of the classic tale of the bamboo cutter who one day cuts the stalk of a glowing bamboo stick only to discover a baby inside. This baby is a celestial princess, and upon taking the emperor's hand in marriage, she's to return home to the moon to be reunited with her people. This modern adaptation keeps all of the original elements intact while adding background content from Kaguya's years growing up in rural Japan. It's clear Takahata didn't want to bastardize the original material in any way, but by fleshing out Kaguya's story during her formative years, it only strengthened the dilemma she faces when she has to make her decision at the end to stay or go. The stipulation for Kaguya's return to the moon is that her memories must remain here on Earth, with the only family she's ever known. She'd fulfill her destiny, but at the cost of her identity, and seeing the highs and lows of her life as we have over the course of 2 hours and 17 minutes, the longest in the Ghibli catalogue, it's quite a punch to the gut to think that all of what made her the person she is will be forgotten, and nobody can ever really be certain if her ascension was worth it. Kaguya's tale is tragic. She spent the better part of her years on Earth happy and loved, and the time she was in complete disarray were the direct result of other people making her decisions for her, with no consideration to her own wishes or feelings. And now this ending isn't much different. It's her decision, but she'll suffer either way. It's a lot more bitter than bittersweet. We hope she'll remember, but we really don't know, and it's up to us to discern the meaning of her final look back on Earth as she leaves. Takahata certainly put his stamp on this tale. With just a few years left to live, he knew well in advance this would be his own parting gift to the world, and for the most expensive Japanese film ever made, he really was uncompromising in his vision. He took a story that had been told across dozens of mediums and over the course of centuries and made himself synonymous with it, providing the world with its definitive edition. Right now, nobody knows what the future holds for Ghibli, and the void they've left in their absence is still yet to be filled. But I like to think with the tale of the Princess Kaguya that Takahata was calling out to the next generation of artists, as if to say this is as high a bar as we can set in the field of animation, and for those just beginning, it's your turn to show the world how much higher you can take it. And if you put everything you have into something you love, who knows how much higher it can go.
まあ理想なんでしょうね、いろいろと。死ぬことも含めて理想でしょ。
Number 10. Whisper of the Heart marked the second time that the studio took a big gamble on a first-time director, but unlike Ocean Waves, which had only released 2 years prior, this one would pay off. Yoshifumi Kondo was handpicked by Miyazaki and set to become his eventual successor should the film have been a hit. And judging from its final quality, you would never have guessed at Kondo's inexperience, trading in the usual fantasy elements for a sincere depiction of teenagers as they struggle to find their creative outlet. Whisper of the Heart earns its Ghibli accolade and set a strong precedent precedent for future first-time artists. Shizuku is an avid reader and aspiring writer, but having only just discovered this side to herself, her creative outbursts are marred with complex feelings of self-consciousness and self-doubt. Her secret admirer Seiji is in a similar position as a violin maker who dreams of one day performing his songs on stage in Italy. He's at a more advanced stage than Shizuku, but despite that, he shares her penchant for self-criticism. It's safe to say that any creative person in any field has felt like this, and Whisper of the Heart, by virtue of its existence, is a clear parable in the strength of perseverance. Whether you're a novice, an intermediate, or advanced, the feelings of uncertainty don't exactly subside, but you can learn how to stop them from paralyzing you. And it's just as well that none of them refused to give up on their dreams, because if any of them had, we wouldn't have had this film's best scene. Some ambitions are too powerful to ignore, and Whisper of the Heart deftly reminds us not to dismiss them. It isn't so much a story of Shizuku finding herself now, but more of her making a promise to the person she could be in the future. She's forging her talents while strengthening her resolve, but what separates this film from others like it is that it doesn't sugarcoat that process. This is exemplified well in these older characters who give frank but loving advice that strides a balance between idealistic and realistic, and that this kind of endeavor requires work and obedience just as much as it does imagination and ability. It's a lot more respectable knowing, as evidenced by this film's existence, that Kondo is speaking from experience. It's hard to think of a weightier message than this one being delivered from a first-time director carrying the Studio Ghibli name on their shoulders. Another point I'd like to credit the film with is the relationship between Shizuku and Seiji. The closing credits show both of them a step closer to realizing their own dreams, with her finally finishing her book and them going on their first official date together. But what I found exceptional was the hook that brought these two characters together in the first place. Shizuku begins as a bookworm and often takes refuge in her local library. One day she discovers that a boy whose name she doesn't recognize has been checking out all of the same books as her, and the dates and sheer volume of books line up too well for it to be a coincidence. This is a strong premise, and for how good it is, I'm surprised I haven't seen it before, because there's a few different ways you could play with that. We have the mystery of the secret admirer, who we already know shares a common interest in the thing Shizuku is most passionate about. But it could also have been that this secret admirer was actually checking out these books first, and Shizuku is unknowingly reading the same books as someone else. We'd know it's a coincidence, and it would change the dynamic of the mystery, but it'd be no less compelling to find out who this person is and what kind of relationship they could form. Or maybe with the local library as their only means of communication, they would discover cryptic clues or leave messages for one another somewhere in the books. It's such an inspired idea because it sells you on their relationship before they've even met, and I can think of very few instances of that being pulled off quite so well. Whisper of the Heart was a really key turning point for the studio, as it was a promising sign of what could be offered outside of Miyazaki and Takahata. Tragically, Yoshifumi Kondo would pass away shortly after its release at the young age of 47. It was his only film, but its legacy is so strong it even endures outside the confines of the Ghibli canon, as it provided the template for the girl from the lo-fi chill mix. Ghibli has a lot of hidden gems in its catalogue, and for those who have even a passing creative interest, this is one of the polished ones. Number 9. If there's one film that I've never heard a single bad word about, it is Kiki's delivery service. There are so many agreeable aspects here, with the most prevalent being its uniquely accurate depiction of young entrepreneurship, chronicling the highs and lows of forging your own identity amidst the all too common callous indifference of the world. And with that comes the all-important message that doing what we love may come at a price, but learning to persevere in the face of setbacks is an invaluable trait. From the pride we get to earning that first paycheck all by ourselves, to the burnout we we risk when straining too hard to monetize our passions, this is a great message about not losing sight of what you want even in the face of discouragement, and it's one that wouldn't be half as strong were it not for the central character, Kiki.
私、魔女のキキです。こっちは黒猫のジジ。お邪魔させていただきます。
Kiki is the heart and soul of this film. Being a witch and having turned 13, it's time for her to set out to an unfamiliar community where she can realize her lifelong dream of opening a delivery service. She has to fend for herself in the big wide world, and though inexperienced, she grows more and more adept to her new surroundings, carefully monitoring her expenses and getting by on trusting her gut. At first, things go well. She embraces her independence with high spirits, and her good manners and seamless integration with the residents of this new city sees her coming home to a new sign and logo lovingly crafted by the in-house baker. Piece by piece, she's creating an effective support structure and reaping the benefits of her hard work. That is until one day, business slows down, because that's just what happens sometimes. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, we hit a plateau, and as her gains turn to losses, the spark that wants to find her starts to dwindle, and she spends the rest of the film on a journey to salvage her spirit before it's lost forever. There's also another theme featured, which is not as prominent, but at times crosses over with and exacerbates Kiki's personal troubles. As a witch and the only supernatural character, she is the exemplar of traditional values and finds herself in a new environment that for all intents and purposes has moved on from the likes of magic and alchemy, favoring technology instead. The beginning of her burnout is the outcome of her clash with modernity. It happens when Kiki presides all afternoon over an old stone-baked oven to prepare a freshly baked pie for her customer, an elderly woman who needs it for her granddaughter's birthday. Without wishing to be late, Kiki weathers a rainstorm just to deliver it on time, only for that granddaughter upon receiving the gift to dismiss it and Kiki's efforts without second thought.
私このパイ嫌いなのよね。
We only see this character for a brief time, but it's clear she's so entrenched in the comforts of her modern lifestyle that she can't see that she did anything wrong here. And this event is Kiki's breaking point. Miyazaki is making the case that we lose something of ourselves when spoiled with convenience, but he's also careful not to dismiss the benefits of modern life either, as there are plenty of times where Kiki benefits from that too, like when she uses the train. It's just a shame all of this is happening to her because it feels like she's being preemptively punished for not having already given up the traditional parts of herself, and so she's stuck feeling like whatever she does isn't good enough and it couldn't have happened to a less deserving person.
Kiki!
From there, things only get worse. She contracts a fever and so is unable to go back to work. After that, Gigi, the only ally she has from her hometown, loses his voice. Up until now, these two have played off each other very well, with Gigi's sardonic but good-natured humor offsetting Kiki's optimism. But now he's mute, like an ordinary cat, and Kiki no longer has a friend to confide in. Then finally, she can't fly anymore, putting her in a position where she can't stay and she can't go. I really commend the film for not pulling its punches with its depiction of depression and burnout. It would have been very, very easy to soften these blows for a younger audience, but Miyazaki is more measured than that. All too often in fiction, what we see of entrepreneurship are either the hard and fast successes or the late stage corruptions, paying little mind or understanding to all the false starts or difficult crossroads that make up those journeys in real life. For that, Kiki as a character is impossible not to root for. Sure, we may lose our spark sometimes, but it's okay to give yourself a break from time to time. When the time is right, we can get back to our duties, whatever they may be, and sure enough, by the end of the film, Kiki has adopted that message, and not only is she flying again, but she gets to save the day. Now I like this ending fine, but this is the only part of the film I would say is extraneous. Her young friend Tombo gets stuck in a giant zeppelin and Kiki rescues him in front of the town, demonstrating a tradition-based solution to a modern-based problem. But the scale of this final conflict isn't a complete match for what is otherwise a character and theme-based film. Tombo had even previously expressed interest in making a flying contraption of his own, so I'm not sure why the finale couldn't have only involved that. It's only a small gripe, but it would have better satisfied the theme of clashing traditional and modern values without the arbitrary appearance of giant fuck-off zeppelin, and Kiki's heroism wouldn't have been any less pertinent.
Gigi.
It's an insightful film about the struggles that come with fostering your independence, and an elusive example of storytelling that I think would resonate more to adults revisiting it than it would to first-time viewers. And it would do so beyond mere nostalgia. It appeals to the best and most ambitious parts of us who, like Kiki, have the courage to pursue their dreams, and a gentle reminder that though your spark may wane from time to time, it's never really gone.
はい。Kiki.
Number 8. Most of the Ghibli canon is very well regarded, with only a handful having ever received a negative or even a tepid reception. But often the best of Ghibli are so well documented they eclipse the lesser known ones, and out of those, there's one I think that gets unfairly maligned, usually dismissed as average if not outright overlooked. The Secret World of Arrietty is a wonderful film, one that's both somber and adventurous, and one that I'm always surprised rarely sees high praise. It centers on a family of scavengers who are only a few inches tall and have to borrow supplies from humans without being detected in order to survive. On Arrietty's first ever scavenge, she comes face to face with a bedridden young boy named Sho, and now that they've been compromised, it's too risky to stay put and they have to pack up and leave. But they're now on the humans' radar, and navigating this world into the unknown will be even more challenging than merely surviving. But the real star is the sense of scale and scope that comes from Arrietty's interactions with the human world. Everything is presented as a potential threat, from the large grasshoppers and cockroaches to the towering mammals like the pet cat and of course the humans. They can never know what they'll run into next, so tensions are always high, but at the same time you're drawn into every image since the animators took everyday recognizable objects and found creative ways to re-establish them as either a tool or as a danger. Arrietty's sword is a pin, her hair clip a peg, the pictures on the wall are all stamps, but my favorite is the set of protruding nails that function as a makeshift footpath for these tiny characters. These really neat touches to the world building are all indicative of the attention to detail we come to expect from the studio, and the impressive sense of scale is complemented by the equally imposing sounds. All of these looming heights and ambient noises converge to form an overall oppressive environment. All in all, the film is enriched by a lot of these very crisp details in both sight and sound. One thing I love about Ghibli is how scene transitions are often accompanied with a quick image of something benign, like a drop of water or a flutter of wind disturbing an otherwise serene backdrop. It's what Japanese director Yasujiro Ozu referred to as pillow shots, which are silent, suspended images used for building up atmosphere or connecting one location to the next. These are present in a lot of the Ghibli library, but in Arrietty, they deserve special commendation for doubling as a threat to our main characters. They, like everything else here, carry a fixed air of tension, and that's a quality unique to this interpretation of this story. Around the midpoint, there's also a well-played subversion, where a human hand tears into the walls of Arrietty's house, and we fear this is the work of the exterminator that's come to catch them. But before panic can set in, the missing wall is replaced by the far fancier one of the dollhouse that we know belongs to Sho. Arrietty and her family live in fear of what humans will do to them, but Sho breaks that image by making them more comfortable in their environment. All his days waiting in bed with an as yet undisclosed illness have spurred on an earnest need of some company. He's lonely, and before long he and Arrietty become friends. It's through their getting to know each other we learn that Sho has a heart condition, one that's potentially life-threatening, and he's since reserved himself to his fate. But Arrietty's passion invigorates him, perhaps for the first time in a long time. To his family, he's been a burden, but for Arrietty and her family, he's their only hope. And so no longer feeling powerless, he helps facilitate their escape in the climax. The two carry out a rescue mission together where Arrietty finally uses her weapon, the first thing she ever borrowed, to break her mother out of her prison just in time before the humans arrive. Thanks to Sho, all the scavengers make it safe safely to their destination, and now he and Arrietty, who have always had to say their abrupt goodbyes, must say it again to each other. Despite their limited time together, it's clear the effect they had on one another was life-affirming. Arrietty gave Sho the inspiration he needed to face his heart operation with courage, and thanks to that courage, she and her family will keep on surviving, now with the additional knowledge that not all humans are bad after all. When they part ways, he gives her a sugar cube, which was all she wanted to borrow on the night he caught her, and in return she gives him her peg and sails away in her teapot ship, leaving behind only a trail of tears. Again, I don't know why Arrietty gets overlooked. Maybe I'm missing something, but what I see is a straightforward story adapted to a well-suited medium, one that delivers equally on sentiment and technical prowess, with each befitting the Ghibli moniker. Looking back, with the early passing of Yoshifumi Kondo and the total non-start of Goro Miyazaki, the search for a worthy apprentice had escaped the studio for more than 25 years. Now, Ghibli are all but gone, and it isn't quite clear yet who is leading the forefront of anime, but I contend that Arrietty is as sure a bet as any of good things to come. Number 7. Porco Rosso is f***ing outstanding. This and the Yamadas are the closest Ghibli comes to straight comedy, and if I could ask Miyazaki for a spin-off to any of his works, it would 100% be this. The 1930s Italian backdrop is lush, and I mean that both in terms of its extravagant upper-class populace and the bright visuals that make it all pop. The action is often spontaneous and varied, comprising of dogfights, sky piracy, and in the end, what can only be described as two complete idiots slugging it out on a beach. I don't know quite how to qualify this, but the vibe of this one is like a vacation, and I absolutely love it. The characters are either hyper capable, like the all-female engineering group, or magnificent bastards, from Don Curtis, a pompous fighter pilot turned Hollywood actor with a very punchable face, to Porco Rosso himself, who boasts all of the qualities I've just mentioned, for better or worse. It's essentially Casablanca meets Wacky Races, with the dry wit and irreverence of the former mixed with the playful adversity of the latter, and I wouldn't have it any other way. It's just a good time all around. Porco, or Marco as he was once known, is an ace pilot, but his experiences fending off fascism during the First World War have left him jaded. He's now cursed to look like a pig, and having all but given up trying to cure his defect, he's taken up a life of semi-retirement as a bounty hunter. But mostly, he spends his days trying to forget the past. He's compelling in a way that other Ghibli protagonists don't often get a chance to be. Almost always, they're young, agile, and with an eye to creating a brighter future, reflecting Miyazaki's own ideals. Marco, on the other hand, is much older and much more self-absorbed. His demeanor is already hardened, and he gets by one day at a time on a flimsy code of ethics and an infectious laugh. He's the complete opposite of your usual Ghibli protagonist, yet endearing all the same. The pig motif in of itself is pretty clear. Marco is a self-serving chauvinist and a skilled tool of destruction. He starts out rather vocally old school in his concern that the mechanics he's entrusted to build his new plane are all female. But then their skill and proficiency kind of blows his mind, as you'd expect in the 1930s from a literal male chauvinist pig. It doesn't take long for their young manager Fio to personally show him up as the best at her craft, which earns his respect and gives him pause for thought. By the end, this same Fio becomes a literal prize for which Don Curtis and many other would-be suitors are all fighting each other. So by this point, Marco is just about the only character not behaving like a pig. After the final showdown, the story is left open-ended with the suggestion that Marco took to the skies, never to see Fio or his other old flame Gina again. But even if we're sure that were the case, there at least existed a time where the two most important people in his life saw him for the man he really was, pig or no pig. Few attempts have been made to synthesize classic noir and Hanna-Barbera cartoons like this, but it's such a good marriage, I can't believe it hasn't spawned any imitators. It's unfortunate Miyazaki never expanded on this one himself, since Marco's lifestyle and the film's carefree ambience would have made for an incredible set of episodic adventures. But with all that we have here, Porco Rosso is escapist fun done well, and I recommend it to absolutely everyone. Now, all things considered, this is a film that never really takes itself too seriously, and that is partly why it's as good as it is. But there is one aspect I wondered about, because when you look at just Miyazaki as a director, his protagonists are commonly either headstrong female warriors or young girls learning how to navigate the world. It's one of his most distinguished trademarks, and unless he has an explicit reason, any deviation from one of those two archetypes just doesn't tend to sustain his interest unless there's some other important factor at play. Ponyo was for his son, and like Castle in the Sky featured dual protagonists. The Wind Rises was a tribute to a real-life figure, and the Castle of Cagliostro was based on a different intellectual property. What remains is How Do You Live, which he has explicitly stated was made for his grandson. And so Porco Rosso being the biggest deviation from his usual norm raises the question, who is Marco based on? And I ask because I suspect the answer is Hayao Miyazaki himself. Marco is instinctive, accomplished, and has an outward affinity for airplanes. He's also an embittered old man who ruminates over the toil of war. He's a sarcastic, chain-smoking loner, full of impulses but with a heart of gold. And perhaps funneling all of this into Marco was a means of expelling the more repressed, even contradictory aspects of himself into something separate but not wholly irredeemable. If we all imagined ourselves as pigs and channeled our basest attributes, perhaps we could all create a character as magnificent as Marco. Of course, that could just be me, but I'd be curious if I'm not alone in that assessment. The more important takeaway is that Porco Rosso is one of those anytime, any place, any mood movies. It's jovial, thoughtful, and a hell of a lot of fun, and we could really use a lot more like it, so give it a shot.
Timmy!
Number 6. In a pre-Studio Ghibli world where Hayao Miyazaki was not yet a household name, an executive rejected his treatment for a dystopian epic fantasy on the grounds that new intellectual properties not based on any existing manga wouldn't be worth the financial risk. And so naturally, Miyazaki's response was to write, draw, and publish a mammoth 6-volume saga of said epic and use it as a basis for getting his film produced. The executive agreed. Incidentally, he was also contractually obliged to provide Miyazaki the use of a wheelbarrow for his massive balls. Impressively, Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind is, for its age, no less distilled a Miyazaki experience. It's set in a ravaged future where humans are locked in a perpetual cycle of violence with the Ohm, who are a race of giant terrifying bug-like creatures, and whose corpses emit toxic spores that are deadly to both the environment and mankind. Both factions have long resigned themselves to the idea that there could never be a peaceful coexistence, and each have it ingrained in them that the responsibility for the state of the world lies with the enemy. The cycle has now continued for so long it's not apparent that any side is even winning at this point, but rather staking their losses after every battle. But Nausicaä has a secret project, the one for which she scavenges for supplies. By collecting the spores left behind in the rotting bodies of the Ohm, she can make the world inhabitable again. Usually spores are mandated for incineration by the villagers due to their lethal toxicity, but under Nausicaä's watch, they can be purified. Her operation synthesizes the spores to form the rare commodities of purified water and sand, and with it a means of cohabitation with the Ohm that would benefit both sides. She really could restore the world, but not without paying a price, and each act of altruism costs her dearly. All of this makes Princess Nausicaä an outlier in her pursuit of peace, and it's no accident that the one scene that provides us a view of her perspective is also the one that's most visually distinct. The flashback to her childhood trauma that sees her trying to save a baby Ohm is bathed in this glamorous gold sheen, in contrast to the desolate setting of the Sea of Decay and the Ohm corpses that populate it. The allegory becomes clearer when observing the charred remains of the Ohm, which bear a striking resemblance to that of smoldering airships, a common Miyazaki staple. The message is war is hell, and if left unchecked, it will blind mankind to its mutually assured destruction. And Nausicaä, who loves all creatures equally, is determined to end the fighting or die trying. She rescues 3 men who are from a rival human faction in the Sea of Decay, and in the process inhales the toxic spores that envelop it. Then she defends the baby Ohm that's being used to stoke the flames for the final battle, and takes a bullet in the shoulder and ankle for her trouble. And finally, when the same baby Ohm, fearing for its life, charges blindly into a lake of acid, she burns her foot trying to push it back. There's no part of herself she isn't willing to risk to prevent this war from continuing, but the price gets steeper every time. I really love the way Miyazaki connects this character to this world, not just as the progenitor of change, but with what feels like an unspoken command she has over the wind itself. From the huge gusts that power the valley by way of Nausicaa's windmills, to the soft breaths she takes through her whistle that quiet the Ohm down. And it's only when a rival faction resurrects one of the long-extinct giant warriors that the wind dies, and her progress is put in jeopardy. The giant warrior was a last-ditch effort to destroy the Sea of Decay and all of the Ohm, though in reality it was a thinly disguised grasp of power over the domain of man, one that neglected the cost the destruction of the Valley of the Wind would have on the world. And shortly after the wind dies, so does Nausicaä. The giant warrior is many things, but most of all he's mankind's hubris manifest, and contains a power so wild and unruly it can only fire off 2 shots before rotting away into sand. This really is a creature as ugly on the inside as it is on the outside, unlike the Ohm, who, being just as conscientious as Nausicaä had suspected, recognize her sacrifice and join together to bring her back to life. Through their tranquility, she can fulfill her role as the savior of the world. Miyazaki's warning of mankind's mutually assured destruction is expressed this time through a motif of tranquility versus rage. It starts when Nausicaä is scavenging for supplies and discovers a wild animal named Tito, whose first instinct is to bite her, but her non-violent resistance is enough to soothe him out of his reactionary trance, and his bite turns into a lick, moving from rage to tranquility, with Nausicaä paying the small price of a drop of blood. After that, when her father is murdered in front of her, Nausicaä wastes no time killing all the men responsible, succumbing to her rage. That is until the wise Lord Yupa blocks her sword with his own wrist, and, exactly as she did for Tito, trades a temporary wound in order to provide her a much-needed moment of clarity. The inhabitants of the Valley of the Wind have been so reliant on rage as a means of defense that it's their first recourse to survive. So it's no wonder Nausicaä too is susceptible to this. But Yupa sees in her the same thing we see. She has the potential to engender some real, lasting, and positive change, and so by refusing to let her take revenge now, she might just save the world later. They both know she's better than this. I especially love the detail that his dagger is pointed at the neck of her would-be victim, meaning he was always in full control of how this situation was going to play out. And his gamble pays off. By the end, Nausicaä, clad in blue robes and facing off a sea of red eyes, shows that even in matters of life and death, tranquility rises above rage. This is the only Ghibli film that feels like a product of its time, and as much of a backhanded compliment as that might sound, I don't mean it as a bad thing at all. The story is timeless, but the style has a distinct 80s anime look and feel to it that's absent by subsequent installments. From the retro sound effects to the way the cells of the armor-plated Ohm shift over one another. There's something almost rudimentary about it, and it gives this one its own personality. With just how much of Miyazaki's style is present, it feels like he put everything he had into this, as if it were his last chance to tell this story, but thankfully that wasn't the case. And on the strength of this great epic anime fantasy, based on an existing intellectual property, Miyazaki, Takahata, and Suzuki all formed the basis on which Studio Ghibli would make their name. And yet despite its age, Nausicaä is still the film that best exemplifies their core beliefs, warning us of a world where prejudice and war intersect with idealism and pacifism, and caught in the fray are princesses, giant creatures, and flying contraptions. In a sense, it's his purest and most Miyazaki-like film, and the venerable god-tier Ghibli films that followed barely required any refinement from the formula he'd already established here. That's an extraordinary feat, and though it wouldn't be made clearer until much later, Nausicaä was a significant game changer, one of the biggest in the history of anime. Number 5. When I first set out to review every Ghibli film, none gave me more trepidation than the prospect of revisiting Grave of the Fireflies. This is easily the best film you'll never want to see again. With no fantasy elements to speak of, and certainly not suitable for audiences younger than teens, just about the only DNA this shares with the rest of Ghibli's output is its unparalleled quality, and it reaches those heights in an inverse proportion to how low you feel after watching it. Grave of the Fireflies is as sobering as cinema gets, and it will break your heart. It recounts a story of survival in Japan during World War II, and the film is depressing from its very first scene, opening on a young boy named Seita dead and slumped over a can of fruit drops that contained the ashes of his baby sister, who he tried and failed to save. These two had their fates sealed from the beginning, and what follows is the harsh and harrowing account of a country that entered a war it had no chance of winning, and how in desperate times a society turned its back on its own children. Seita is a stand-in for Akiyuki Nausicaä, who in reality would live and go on to pen the 35-page memoir on which this film is based, but even though the film's prologue is the only account of events that's fictionalized, it's no less honest for it. I don't doubt for a minute the guilt he felt for losing the people he loved along the way, and now with this film, we are made to grieve with him. Seita was only 14 years old when he was left to fend for himself and his sister Setsuko in a war-torn Japan. Their father was away fighting, and their mother had been the victim of a gruesome bombing, and what followed was the pair weathering the storm together, banking on the promise that soon life would resume as normal. But as the political climate shifted around them, updates as to the whereabouts of their father were becoming less frequent, and as food ran in short supply, pressure mounted on every civilian who were beginning to turn desperate, and these two found themselves more and more at the mercy of others' indifference. It starts with their mother's death, so Seita and Setsuko move in with their aunt, but the once welcoming familial connection turns sour as resources become more scarce, and it isn't long before they're thrown out on their own again. These were times of strife, and we are witness to every single loss adjustment these two have to make through their bouts of malnutrition, their crying for their parents, and eventually Setsuko's death. It is a stern reminder of just how fragile our relationships are, and as a society, we're only ever a few steps away from crumbling once the chaos sets in. We can only hope stories like this provide us with the insight and introspection necessary to ensure no other scenario like this can ever take place again. Because Seita and Setsuko's story is just one of millions like it, and it's tragic to think lives like these aren't just cut short, but are plagued with struggle and suffering the entire time. The few occasions of respite are so sparse and so short-lived, you clutch onto what you can, even knowing in the back of your mind it won't last. Setsuko carries with her a can of fruit drops, and it's just about the only thing keeping her happy, so when she runs out, she's inconsolable. But Seita fills her can with his ration water, giving her one last taste of all the flavors at once. This, like so many of his solutions, aren't permanent and only kicks the can further down the road, but it's at least a brief instance where Setsuko is transported away from the reality of her situation. And as long as she's happy, Seita can be happy too. The other positive comes when the pair spot some fireflies and spend the night catching them in a glass jar. It's the one time where Seita and Setsuko are permitted to just be kids and do what they would likely be doing anyway were it not for the ongoing war. Then when the pair wake up the next morning, all of the fireflies are dead, and the grave of fireflies Setsuko digs with her hands has a few valuable meanings. She's still so young, so she couldn't really comprehend what had happened to her mother when she died, but as she clears the fireflies into the grave, she tells Seita that she understands, and it absolutely breaks him. It also foreshadows the pair's own fate as lives tragically cut short. And then there's the artwork depicting Seita carrying Setsuko among a swarm of fireflies. But if you bring up the saturation, you can make out the shadow of a bomber plane in the background, and you realize these aren't fireflies at all. There's an old adage in storytelling that you must put your characters through hell and then lead them out. Grave of the Fireflies is different. It takes you to hell and leaves you there. It's not a film designed to bring you escapism or catharsis, but given the purpose of the original material, it provides something more. It's a bleak and brutal real-life account of two innocent children caught in a hopeless situation, and with it the lesson that life is short, sometimes a lot shorter than it needs to be, so we should lead a forthright one. In the end, Seita's ghost reunites with Setsuko, and together they play with the fireflies one last time. with regards to Nausicaä, I only hope that through his memoir he could purge his guilt, and that thanks to Takahata's adaptation, he could see just how many lives his story touched before he passed away in 2015. I hope he was finally able to forgive himself, because we all know these children deserved better. Grave of the Fireflies is a profound tribute to one of humanity's most shameful chapters, and will continue to honor them in time. Number 4. Isao Takahata has been rightfully revered for his contributions to cinema, with special commendation given to his first and final Ghibli entries. But nestled among these is a lesser-known film, and one that I have no qualms calling Takahata's greatest achievement. It's the masterpiece nobody talks about, and that is 1991's Only Yesterday. Culturally and tonally, it shares parallels with the novel Colorless Tsukuru Tazaki by Haruki Murakami, with the day-to-day enterprise of Japanese life and the unraveling of the mysteries of the main character's past. Story-wise and structurally, it owes something to Wild Strawberries by Ingmar Bergman, with its main character having their long-forgotten memories triggered as they roam through a place that feels like home. The key difference being that our main character Taiko is 27 years old, and rather than reflecting on her whole life looking back, she's reassessing the ordeals that have shaped her life so far and determining where to go next. To some, that may strike as an odd pairing given the esotericism of the former and the prestige of the latter. Whether it was partially inspired by them or wholly original, Only Yesterday is a distinct enough combination of all of those elements that it carries its own identity, and one that keenly lines up with Takahata's own greatest strength as a storyteller, that he can take events that ought to be mundane and extract the universe from them. And for how well Only Yesterday executes on its premise, it is an absolute sin that his sharpest work is also his most ignored. I suppose there's some poetic irony that so much of what makes up his films is the theme of legacy and how we'll be remembered, and this, his best film, is poised to be his most forgotten. The story opens in the early 1980s with an adult Taiko traveling to the countryside to take a break from her work-centric lifestyle in Tokyo, but on her way the narrative splits between present day and episodes of a younger Taiko, which are played out as distant memories that come rushing back to her. So it's episodic, but the episodes are driving the narrative, with the whole being worth more than the sum of its parts. Though the memories seem innocuous at first, they're frequent and vivid enough that Taiko can't help but wonder, what is she trying to tell herself, and why now? One of the first flashbacks sees her bringing a pineapple back home for her family to try, but her excitement is deflated when the whole family is unimpressed, and the first seeds of self-doubt are sown into her. We see the contrast between the reserved, almost to the point of blandness adult version and this more giddy child version, and this incident is the first of many steps in that degradation. Their actions here were enough to burrow their way in and stick with Taiko long into adulthood, and it's only now she really begins processing them. In each episode, Taiko was made to question herself despite not doing anything wrong or even that outlandish for a child of her age. All the people who chipped away at her worth like this weren't necessarily trying to be cruel, but their words and actions were so cavalier and so piercing, they locked her onto this path of regression that has only been removing her from her fully realized self. And now with this break in the present and physically away from all the familiar markers that make up her life, she's finally reconnecting with those lost parts of herself because they never really went away. It's refreshing to see adult Taiko start to let loose as she regains more and more memories. We get to watch her enjoy picking flowers in the countryside and laments her childhood days spent in the city, where her better instincts couldn't serve her as well as they might have in the country. We're watching her intermittently get broken down as a child while building herself back up as an adult, and thanks to the partly narrative-driven, partly episodic structure, we're invested in essentially two versions of one character at different but equally pivotal points in her life. It's a perfect match between the story being told and the way it's being told. What I love about the flashbacks is that they aren't just tools that are conveniently situated to affect Taiko in a specific way in the present. The experiences aren't these overt twists that give way to dramatic revelations. They're simply revealing the tapestry of her life that amounts to who she is today. But who she is today isn't in line with how she'd imagined herself. She's not broken, but she's not fulfilled either, and these memories show her that her life has been characterized by some lower points than she may have realized, and now is the time to resolve them by herself. And the more easygoing and personable she's becoming, the more you believe she can do it. Usually coming of age or slice of life tales like this revolve around a group of young kids or teenagers, since that's when the subject is at its most pertinent. But it's easy to overlook the fact that life is a constant series of lessons and turning points, and Isao Takahata understood this better than anyone. Whether it meant devastating the world over with his depiction of the fragility of life in Grave of the Fireflies, or spending the final 8 years of his own life bearing his soul in the tale of the Princess Kaguya. The man spent his whole career considering the ultimate meaning of life, and where Only Yesterday distinguishes itself is that it asks that question at a time where it's not too late for our main character. And with the threads to her past no longer intruding on her present, she now has a clean slate, and what she chooses to do in this moment in time will define who she is from now on. So as she walks back through the countryside and the credits roll, behind her is every kid from her past, including her own 10-year-old self, and she leads the way without looking back until finally getting in the car and driving away, content to close this chapter of her life for good and start anew in the countryside. And since this is the end, she's also leaving us behind, but we're safe in the knowledge that this is the first day of the rest of her life. She finally became who she is. Only Yesterday is one of the most masterful depictions of self-actualization I've ever seen. It reminds us that we're all the sum of our memories and past experiences, even those we've already forgotten. But if any of them are holding us back, or if we aren't fulfilled in our lives today, we don't have to be tethered to them forever. We all have control over our own lives. We only require the courage to dig deep and change it, just like Taiko. And with that, we come to the end of Isao Takahata's legacy with the studio. The man was second only to the great Hayao Miyazaki, and though he only released half the number of films under the banner, his impact was no less potent for it. Above all, his films had courage, always asking big questions and never skipping on important details. Easily the most rewarding aspect of watching the entire Ghibli catalogue has been the discovery of their hidden gems. And though Only Yesterday may not be that gem for everyone the way it was for me, if you only take one message away from this review, it's to take a chance on one of their lesser known titles, because it might just be the best film you've never seen. Number 3. If anyone were ever curious about giving Ghibli a chance but didn't know where to begin, Princess Mononoke is almost always the one I tell them to watch. Because if this doesn't convince them, perhaps the series at large just isn't for them. Princess Mononoke is set in an alternate version of feudal Japan, where society is on the cusp of developing new infrastructure and weapons thanks to the mining of iron deep within the forest. But the inhabitants of this forest, which are made up of giant deities, are willing to fight to the death to prevent their homes from this invasion. There are boar gods, wolf gods, ape tribes, and all of them are tangled in a great ongoing battle for ownership of the land with the humans of Irontown. I'd say more than anything, this film is a natural evolution of the themes in Nausicaä. The stakes are similarly apocalyptic, but there are more factions involved and a greyer morality across all their leaders. Where Nausicaä appealed to our innate goodness, treating tranquility as the rationale and rage as the foreign object, Mononoke addresses the inverse. These characters may think themselves noble in their pursuits, but in order to be victorious, they can and will lean into their baser aggressions. There are no clean hands here, and everyone is full of rage, though some are trying to remedy that more than others. And though the wolves are put in the most favorable light, being the wisest and most level-headed, none of the tribes are without their flaws. The boar gods, who are proud to a fault, are too susceptible to blind rage, which is literally the case with their leader. Our first introduction is one such boar taken by a curse and whose anger is rotting him from the inside out as he lashes out at our hero, Prince Ashitaka. Having taken down the boar, Ashitaka is now cursed and must travel west to find a cure, never to return. It's here where he stumbles into enter this war and first encounters the wolf gods, who are more pragmatic and effective than the boars, but still fighting an uphill battle against the humans, thanks to the efforts of their adoptive daughter, the wolf girl's son, aka Princess Mononoke. They're spearheading the war, but the destruction of the forest is outpacing their efforts to save it. San is a character trapped between these two identities. She loves her wolf family and the forest, and they've always been home to her, but she despises herself for the implicit knowledge that she is human, whether she embraces it or not. Then there's the ape tribe, who share the same outlook as the wolves and boars, but lack the will to effectively change anything. They speak slowly and simply as if impaired, and act on superstition, even attempting to eat Ashitaka as a means of gaining his human power. I don't think it's an accident that the only animals painted in a negative light are also the closest progenitors to humans. San and Ashitaka are the main outliers in this story, and that trait is shared by the very spirit of the forest itself. The forest spirit is not a concept, but a uniquely identifiable creature, and with this character design, Miyazaki's environmental sensibilities are more robust than ever. It's understood by everyone as being nature incarnate, and all the forest animals pay their due respect as it treads through the environment, giving and taking life as it wills. And once having interacted with Ashitaka, he cures his bullet wound and saves him from death, but leaves his curse. And Ashitaka's extended foray into this fight is fated to change its trajectory forever. Which brings me to the prime enemy and leader of the human faction, Lady Eboshi of Irontown. Throughout the film, she is responsible for all of the terrible occurrences. In fact, it was she who personally wounded the boar god that cursed Ashitaka in the first place. Eboshi is the exact villain I wanted Mushka to be in Castle in the Sky. She has her shades of mania and is plainly ruthless, but it doesn't rob her entirely of her humanity either. In a surprising act of charity, she takes in a colony of lepers at a time where anybody else would have discarded their value completely, and it's difficult to ascertain what ulterior motive there would be for her to do this other than a genuine care and affection for her fellow men, so long as those men work for her. Some of the more astute lepers are savvy to this, but even so, the fact remains she gave them food and clothing when nobody else would. We may find ourselves shocked that the same person who took in a community of people whose limbs were falling off is the same person who would look at Ashitaka's cursed hand and try cutting it off herself. But her worst deed comes when she encounters the great forest spirit, and she does the unthinkable. Upon its decapitation, a curse much like Ashitaka's multiplies and spews forth in a flurry throughout the forest, and the finale is dedicated to righting this wrong. And here, just for a handful of frames, after the headless forest spirit covers Irontown, you can actually see the lepers are healed. On the cusp of dawn, Ashitaka and San reattach its head, and when they do, the cursed flurries dissipate, and the entire ecosystem is reshaped into one more closely resembling what we have today. In the blink of an eye, we go from witnessing an epic clash between indeterminable gods and spirits to suddenly nothing but an ordinary forest amidst a peaceful backdrop. We survived. The humans won, but it doesn't exactly feel like a victory. And I think that's why this ending is so resonant. It feels more like the responsibility now falls to us to carry on the legend of what happened here today, because we're the only traces of it left. That is save for a Kodama. These gentle tree spirits were signifiers of peace and health throughout the film, and Ashitaka even observed the few times they were absent. But after all the toil and death and violence, this Kodama appears as a good omen for things to come, provided we never forget that this was once a land ruled by giants. It's especially insightful seeing what a 13-year gap does to the sensibilities of a man who, frustrated with the minimal progress of the world during his years of filmmaking, made the decision for one production cycle to release his inhibitions, delivering a film full of graphic imagery like limbs torn apart and heads blown off. This is Miyazaki at his most raw, and honestly, Harvey Weinstein should consider himself lucky he didn't use that sword to nail his ass to the fucking door. For refusing to be intimidated in that meeting, the Ghibli canon was salvaged and could be spread to the world unmolested. Princess Mononoke went on to become the biggest hit of Japan upon release. And though Spirited Away would go on to surpass it in acclaim, it was this meeting and Princess Mononoke that facilitated Ghibli's grand entrance onto the global stage. Number 2. Throughout Japanese film history, there has been a determinate number of revolutionary films which from their humble beginnings in Japan ended up shaking the foundations of cinema worldwide, permanently transforming the landscape. These include, but are not limited to, films like Tokyo Story, Harakiri, and Akira. But even with their prestige, it was usually the titles alone that made their way through to the inner circles of cinephiles, and the filmmakers themselves rarely attained the household name status held by their American counterparts. For 50 years, the exception to that rule was Akira Kurosawa, whose contributions led to several paradigm shifts, from Rashomon necessitating the inclusion of the Best Foreign Film category at the Oscars, to Yojimbo, which functioned as a progenitor of the American Western. The likelihood of a Japanese director earning a spot in the pantheons of film history like this is so infinitesimal, it requires a degree of skill, luck, perseverance, fortitude, courage, and humility that we'd be lucky to see once in a century. And it's now happened twice. By the turn of the 21st century, Hayao Miyazaki cemented that status for himself. He had already cultivated an impressive library of would-be classics over some decades, but in 2001, he was the first Japanese director to step out of the large shadow left by Kurosawa and officially became the defining voice of the new era of Japanese cinema, with the transcendental Sen to Chihiro no Kamekokushi. And when it arrived overseas in 2003, no one in the world could have braced themselves for Spirited Away. After this, anime was no longer treated as a risky prospect, better relegated to manga or TV serializations. And animation was no longer just a thing to keep children occupied. It had been legitimized, upgraded from a niche into a bona fide medium, and helped strip away any stigma that it may have previously garnered. Films of this caliber are astronomically rare, and Spirited Away is one such example that is deserving of all of its acclaim. It's not me who makes the film makes itself, and I have no choice but to follow. Miyazaki's quote here reminds me of something similar Tolkien once said, about how the tale grew in the telling. What's unbelievable is just how much further Miyazaki embodied that philosophy. Tolkien at least knew the broader strokes of his story before putting pen to paper, but in the case of Spirited Away, the script was barely in production when Miyazaki had already begun working on the storyboards. The film was effectively born out of his sketches. This renegade style of composition shouldn't work, but I think it does here by virtue of how much of the film Miyazaki personally works on. Instead of delegating, which would come with the risk of filtering or misinterpreting his vision, his team can more aptly follow him on his own journey, and judging from its quality, it's obvious this is where Miyazaki is within his element. It may also explain why there are so few traditional storytelling tropes present, yet each scene draws you in and feels like one of many linchpins. They each have a degree of intensity about them, from the one-time appearance of this spirit in the elevator, who through appearance alone somehow conveys his whole character, through to the first sighting of the young boy Haku, who is now a dragon, and the barrage of flying paper cutouts attacking him. Everything feels like the most important event happening as it's taking place, so it's not easy to pin down exactly what Spirited Away is. It'd be reductive to say it's about any one thing, but among them the most pertinent is of course the growth of the main character, Chihiro. She starts as a brat, not unlike your typical 10-year-old, and the source of her frustrations lies in her inability to effectively communicate. It's the same problem that the temporary antagonist No Face has, communicating through benign grunts in place of words and buying affection with nuggets of gold instead of sincere friendship. It's only when they set aside their complaints that they engineer some positive changes around them, be it brokering peace between the twin witches who have long stopped communicating with each other, or freeing Haku from his curse by telling him his real name, something he cannot do himself. It feels like all the scenes have these kinds of sudden revelations to them that shift everything, with only some invisible connective threads keeping them from feeling incoherent. Like how Chihiro holds her breath when crossing the bridge to cloak her from all the spirits, except No Face, and it's never explained. Adding to this is another motif of being trapped in water. For example, Chihiro can't run home because of the sudden flood that prohibits her, trapping her in the spirit realm. Then Haku is revealed to in fact be the spirit of a river who has been trapped in this persona, and the demon that enters the bathhouse, which has a dedicated amount of screen time to it, ends up being a water spirit trapped by these foreign objects. The more Chihiro remedies this motif for other people, the less power it has over her, and we see this reach its peak in the film's most infamous scene, Chihiro riding the train. As it glides over the shallow waters, she takes a moment to sit and stare out the window, quietly drinking in all of her experiences so far. It stands in contrast to the last time she reflected like this, where she cried in silence. But here, she's perfectly calm. We come to realize that who she is now is not the same person who first stepped in here. The water is still, and Chihiro can finally begin to make her way home. I'm still not done fully discerning the meaning of this motif, but Spirited Away unquestionably invites and rewards that kind of willful analysis. I suspect Miyazaki himself will never fully understand it either, but fortunately we don't have to, for it to remain, by most accounts, the pinnacle of anime and one of the greatest films ever made. And as much as it could take the #1 spot, I decided that in keeping with the spirit of Miyazaki with regards to his filmmaking approach, it's not me who makes the review makes itself, and I have no choice but to follow. But for first bringing my attention to Studio Ghibli, I'll always be grateful to Spirited Away, and it's one that I don't think I'll ever stop coming back to. Number 1. If we suppose our imaginations are unending like the night sky, then great stories are much like the constellations, by which we establish connections between and draw upon their innate mythology. We document these for the sake of posterity, and years later we may still recognize and admire them, all the while knowing there's an infinite canvas of others waiting to be explored in much the same way. Across his career, Miyazaki has made several constellations of his own, with the biggest and brightest being Spirited Away. But long before that, when Ghibli were just at their beginning, he made an unprecedented accomplishment, creating a film with no villain, no plot, no conflict, and virtually none of the traditional staples of storytelling. And yet it is replete with just as much emotion and profundity as the best of them. When Miyazaki made My Neighbor Totoro, it's as if he removed the constellations to reveal the stars. In stripping out the conventional foundations of storytelling, he freed up space to explore the worldview as seen through the lens of these two young girls, Satsuki and Mei, as they navigate through a changing environment, and with it comes their slow adoption of knowledge of the natural world and the ways in which they might take refuge in imagination. The environment wouldn't look out of place in a slice of Japanese life in the 1940s, lining up with Miyazaki's own childhood, but the actual setting and time is kept ambiguous so as to not diminish the film's timelessness. It sees Satsuki and Mei move with their dad to a new house in the countryside. Their mother is sick and staying in a nearby hospital, and life in her absence, though difficult, must nevertheless continue. From the outset, both girls are completely uninhibited by their new surroundings, playing with whatever they find in front of them, even chasing sentient dust mites through a decrepit old house. Miyazaki shows us the joys of discovery early on, and as the adults of this world are quick to demonstrate, this is something to be nurtured and cherished. The line between fantasy and reality is blurred from the get-go, and the deeper they explore both their natural environments and their imaginations, it invariably leads to their meeting with Totoro. The girls are completely unquestioning when they meet Totoro for the first time. They just accept him because all of their interactions at this age are like a new discovery for them. And Totoro, who serves as their guardian, is a precise synthesis of nature and imagination, and a fitting representative of Miyazaki's deepest held beliefs. More than just the face, Totoro is the heart and soul of Studio Ghibli. I think on a psychological level, Totoro serves the same role for children that a teddy bear or security blanket might do, where the comfort he exudes just from his presence is enough to stifle any fears. And I think this is a really fundamental and often overlooked aspect of childhood. Miyazaki encapsulated all the complexities of taking refuge in nature and imagination into this one character. And Totoro himself isn't all that dissimilar to the girls in that he too accepts this encounter, strange and uncommon as it may be for him. When seeing the umbrella, he goes from startled to inquisitive to amused, and beneath this sort of gormless And beneath this sort of gormless hysteria is a poignant reminder to the girls that you never have to feel scared or alone, because Totoro's there. When I said this film had no conflict, I may have spoken out of turn. What I mean is there's no specific antagonist or really any evil force that actively blocks Satsuki and Mei. It would have been so easy to fall into the trap of featuring some sniveling killjoy with a jaded past, determined to ruin the sanctity of childhood just because he had a bad one, only to have his heart warmed at the last minute by the appearance of Totoro. Thankfully, Miyazaki is beyond that, and where the conflict does arise is the inner conflict exhibited by Satsuki and especially Mei. For example, Mei, being the younger of the two siblings and so less knowledgeable than Satsuki about the situation with their sick mom, passes the time by staring at some acorns, expecting them to grow at any minute. This tells us a lot about where she is and how she processes time. Her patience here is partially an innate curiosity that comes from being a young child and observing things for the first time. But this state of waiting is also something she's had to do a lot recently regarding her mom. It sows the seeds of frustration and confusion since their mom's health is in a constant state of question, and they're powerless to really do anything. And therein lies the conflict. It only worsens when the fear of the worst strikes. And Mei sets out on her own, hoping to find the hospital where her mom is, bringing with her a stock of corn as a present and putting herself in real danger. After she gets lost, it's up to Satsuki and the villagers to patrol the area and find her. Miyazaki's reverence for nature is on full display here. The paths are huge and the gardens are massive. Everything is so grandiose to the point where the same girls whose faces once filled the entire screen have never looked smaller and more vulnerable. It's often the case we see ourselves as the center of events, but taking in our immediate surroundings like this from time to time would demonstrate otherwise, and Miyazaki is fond of reminding us of that. We are just a small part of this grand world. This segment, which resembles a plot at its most minimalist, again without relying on an antagonist or evil force influencing it, is absolutely gripping. Your heart goes out to Satsuki and Mei throughout this ordeal, and just as things might look hopeless and with no other recourse left, who can they turn to? Totoro looks like he doesn't move much for anybody, but he can be relied on when something needs to be done, and so he summons the cat bus and takes the girls right to their mom. And as an aside, I absolutely love the detail that Mei runs the wrong way around the cat bus to see Satsuki. My Neighbor Totoro is so earnest because even with how overtly happy and heartwarming it is, and it absolutely is, this is one of the best feel-good films ever put to screen, it still knows when to temper that. This is still a world rife with sickness and concern, but Totoro is there to show us that there's always room for hope and comfort, and whenever we need him most, he'll be there. Encouraging children to see their imagination as a place of refuge like this, in tandem with respecting the natural environment around them, is a strong message for them to internalize. And for how exceptionally Miyazaki expresses it, this might just make Totoro the most essential children's film ever made. It's one that has to be seen and felt in order to be understood, and it's not often you find a story and premise this simple and this accessible that's also this profound. Miyazaki encapsulates the experience of childhood so vividly that My Neighbor Totoro will make you feel nostalgic for memories you don't have. The man has a lot of things to say in his films, but Totoro is the best part of what he has to say. That by embracing our loved ones and treasuring our imaginations, we will be equipped to overcome any adversity life throws us. Much like Kiki, it's a message that will imprint on young children, but also one that adults should recall from time to time. This is what life could and should be, and all of it was drawn from a story where nothing happens, and I never wanted it to stop. The craziest thing about Totoro's debut is that during its initial run, it was screened as a double feature with Grave of the Fireflies, with this one coming second. That is a rollercoaster ride I don't think I could ever prepare to take, but I do wonder how well the two films would complement one another when viewed like this, because in no uncertain terms, you have the saddest anime ever made, followed by the happiest anime ever made, with the common thread of two bewildered children just wanting to be with their parents. I can only imagine how utterly transformed the the good people of 1988 would have felt if they'd happened to pass by the poster and decided on a whim to kill a couple of hours in the cinema. Perhaps one day I'll watch them like this and report what I find. After all, if great art can heal wounds, then Grave of the Fireflies is the antiseptic that stings, while My Neighbor Totoro is the bandage that protects. Putting it that way, maybe they're meant to be viewed together after all, and maybe from time to time we should remember to unlearn the constellations to look at the stars.